Now we're going to make a boss. We're going to use this little bee here, and we're going to hook up a couple of his attacks, set up a whole environment, and make a bit of a challenge for our player. We're also going to use some cinematics to introduce him. The first thing we're going to want to do is make sure that you've committed to source control, because if you didn't and you have any kind of mistake here, you're going to end up breaking your player's character controller and really wish that you had source control so that you could go back to it. So we're going to take the Bee and Fish package. You should be able to download that and drag it into our project. You see here that it's got a bunch of animations for our bee, and it also has a bunch for the fish. It's got some prefabs for some of the special effects, the lightning, the explosion, and some bullet spikes that can fly off of the fish. But there's also right up here, if I look and find the correct spot, there are all of the character animations. I want to remove those, uncheck those. And then there's an animator controller that I'm trying to find. There it is, the robot character controller. If you don't uncheck those, you're going to need to go back and undo your changes. You're going to want to go back and revert that so that you don't break and lose your character controller setup. Let's hit import now. And now I should see all of my things. Now, again, if you messed up, you made a mistake, you can go to your plastic window, go to change sets, and then scroll to the last change set. So it'd be this toggle locks one, right click and hit switch workspace to this change set, or revert to change set, and it'll undo your changes. Revert will actually undo your pending changes. Switch to will require you to actually locally undo your pending changes. So you probably want to hit revert to, and it'll take you back to that past version. If that gives you any problems, you can always go over here, hit the little gear, and hit launch plastic SEM, and then do the same thing in there. It tends to work, and when it occasionally fails in here, although most of the time it just works in here as well. All right, so now we've got our bee imported. Let's go find him. If we go to the prefabs folder, you should see that there's already a bee prefab object set up and made. I can grab it and drag it right into my scene and put it right around near the key. And by the way, when I said this was set up and made, this is the way it came from the artist. It's already set up. It's just with the animations on it. We're going to flip the rotation now so that it's facing the correct direction. I want it to face towards my player. So I'll just go find the rotation and set that to 180. And I'm going to rename this object to bee root, because I'm going to need to be able to move this piece around and reference a whole bunch of different parts of this bee object. Now, I don't want my bee to be there initially. I want my bee to appear when my player gets close. So I'm thinking my player comes over here, they think it's all clear, it's nice and easy run to the key, they get right here, and all of a sudden a bee pops up and appears and kind of blocks their path. So what we're going to need to do is add in some sort of a trigger to kind of activate and start this whole sequence off. Before we do that, though, I want to set this up as a full encounter. It's going to be a bunch of different pieces that are all tied together, and I want to group them together so that it's easy to tell that they're related and to work with them in the future. So to do that, I'm going to right click and just create an empty game object. We'll call this bee encounter. And we'll reset the transform so that we've got it all zeroed out. I'm going to take my bee root object and just make it a child of that bee encounter. And then I'm going to right click and hit create empty. And let's create a bee trigger. I'm going to add a box collider 2D to it and check the is trigger box. Now what I want to happen is when I enter this trigger, my cinematics will kick off and the whole bee encounter thing starts and the fight kind of begins. It's like the boss battle begins. Camera maybe changes, maybe my controls change, I don't know. Whatever things I want to fire off, they're going to fire off from this bee trigger happening. So when we enter this trigger, we're going to want to do one or more things, and I don't really know what those things are going to necessarily be. So I'll create a more generic script that uses Unity events that we can hook up to whatever different things we decide we need. So we'll go into the scripts folder, and let's just minimize this down. And I'm going to create an event trigger script. So let's create a right click, create a new C# script, call this event trigger. Or let's call this, do you want to call it event trigger or trigger event? I'm going to call it event trigger. I think that makes more sense. It's the trigger for my events. I'm going to go add this to the bee trigger object. As soon as it allows me to select it. There we go. We'll take our event trigger, drag it on there, and I'll open up that script. Now we're going to want to listen to an on trigger enter 2D because we want to find out when the player comes in. These event triggers are only going to listen for the player. So add on trigger enter 2D. And we'll first check to see if the thing that's touching us is a player. So we'll just check the tag. We'll say if not collision dot compare tag, and then we'll check against player. Then we'll return. Otherwise, we'll fire off our on-triggered event. So let's actually go up to the top and add a serialized field. There we go, a serialized field. The autocomplete and everything popped up right over me. And the serialized field is going to be of type Unity event. And I'll hit escape, alt enter, and add that using statement for Unity engine.events. Let's call this on event triggered. Now I'm going to call that down below, so I'll just double click, copy it, and Control V to paste, and question mark dot invoke it below. So now whenever we enter the trigger with a player, we'll invoke this on event triggered. Now that's good, but I only want this to happen once. So let's add in a check to see whether or not it's already been triggered. I'll add that down below. We'll say if triggered, then return as well. And then we'll say otherwise, we'll say triggered equals true. So that way it'll only get called once. We don't have a triggered variable. So I'll hit home, alt enter, and generate a field for it. I'm going to double click that private, hit enter there, and add in a little bit of spacing. I want to remove these two extra using statements at the top and that extra little line at the bottom, save it off, and I think this looks pretty good. We could combine these statements, but I think that leaving them separate is a little bit easier to read and the file small enough that it's not going to make a difference. So now we've got our event trigger. Let's go back into Unity now and use it to toggle some things. Let's start by just turning on a camera that shows our B in the player fight. First, I've got my B. I've made sure to move him up here. If you didn't move your B already, just get him out of the way. But I'm going to right click and create a new Cinemachine virtual camera. I'm going to call this virtual camera B and make it a child of the B encounter. I'll make sure that I'm in move mode and drag it around. I want to drag this ortho size down to something like a 7 though, so that I can see this whole area, but not too much more. I think right about to there is probably pretty good. Now I'm going to go to my B trigger, and in our new on event trigger that we have available, I will hit the plus option and drag our virtual camera B in, choose game object and set active, and just set it to true. That means that by default, I'm probably going to want to have this B camera off, but I do want to make sure that the priority is higher than my normal camera. So I'm going to crank it up to 100 and then turn it off. Now I'm going to go back to this B trigger and let's take a look at it. I'm going to hit F and go zoom in, and look, we've got this little tiny box here. You can kind of see the green there. That's not the collider that I want. I want to have a collider over here that my players touch, and as soon as they touch it, the encounter kind of starts. So I'm going to drag it over here and kind of see it there underneath the ground. And then I'm going to adjust the collider size. I'm going to take the X, I'll just make it like a 20, and I'll make the Y about a 20 as well. Put this over this entire area, so if the player gets anywhere over here, it's going to trigger it instantly. Now, I've got that set up, I think, correctly. So I'm going to save, and I'm going to press play. We'll run over there, and I'm going to see if the camera switches once I get into that position. Again, I turned my level 1 intro off, so we don't have to watch that pop up, or watch the entire intro every time. Here we go, run over. If I can dodge the frog, there we go. Once I get into this area, yep, the camera has switched and we're ready for the B to fly in. So let's save, and I think we've gone quite a few changes in. Let's go save off what we've got. So we've added the B to the level and an event trigger to start the encounter, and we'll check that in.